Welcome to Muckrakers, where we dig through the latest happenings around so-called AI. In each episode, we contextualize the most important recent events and try to separate muck from meaning. I'm your host, Jacob Hames, and joining me is my co-host, Igor Kravchuk.
Thanks, Jacob. In this episode, we will talk about Senate Bill 1047, a bill in California that has now passed through both the state's House of Representatives and the Senate, but is still waiting on a signature from Governor Gavin Newsom as of recording this episode.
And before we start in on that, we wanted to note that not much made noise in AI this week, except Sam Altman, who seemingly won't shut up. He made a blog post saying that plausibly AGI is within the next 1,000 days, presumably shilling to governments and investors. Uh, Perhaps more notably, OpenAI is rumored to become for profit in the near future, I think near the beginning of next year, with Sam getting equity. Most people always knew that this was going to happen eventually, but now the mask is off. What's interesting about this is that OpenAI sees roughly $5 billion in losses and $3.7 billion in revenue, which means any sort of profit is purely speculative. There's not yet any economic viability for the current business models that they've been working on. So maybe accidentally or intentionally, this going for profit is more of a distraction. Not sure.
However, what is a lot more signal than noise, and always a good sign for a promising a young tech venture, is if the CTO and researchers who were from the very early beginnings leave so suddenly that the CEO is surprised by it and needs to address it at the next all hands meeting at the company, which is what happened with OpenAI. Miriam Morati, who was one of the very photogenic founders, of which only Sam is left right now, and Greg if he comes back from a sabbatical. But let's say if that happens.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see how that goes for them. And at the same time, the very expensive flagship product, O1, that they are putting a lot of effort into selling and seem to be planning to build the new direction of the company around, is still really bad at the thing that it's supposed to be doing well, which is planning. In a recent benchmark paper about function calling, O1 vastly underperformed expectations, which, is a thing. And in just for fun news, TSMC execs, so like the people who probably know the most about semiconductor production in the world, got a sales pitch by Sam Altman about he gives them $7 trillion of investment, and they built him 36 fabs to make more compute for his AI. I think the quote was to make compute flow as electricity, and they were not impressed. A senior exec called him a podcasting bro and called his ideas ridiculous. So
Well,
let's see.
I don't know. Personally, I take offense to that.
I mean, you haven't pitched anyone to build 36 semiconductor fabs for $7 trillion investment, though.
That's true. That's true. All right. So for those of you that have been keeping track of this bill, you'll know that actually it has already been vetoed by Governor Gavin Newsom. It happened during the recording that we were making, actually. So, what does that mean? Well, the Senate and the House of California could override this veto with a two-thirds majority. The other options are that it goes back to sort of the drafting phase, so effectively starting from scratch, but taking the lessons that were learned from this process and incorporating them into the next version. It could also get incorporated into various other bills. So, for example, the whistleblower protections part could be put into a different AI legislation bill, or it could be thrown out altogether. There are a lot of different options here, and again, not a legal expert. Please don't treat me as one, but that's just what I know about the system. I still think that this is a really interesting thing to go through and to think about, what was the bill actually saying? Maybe even why did Governor Gavin Newsom veto the bill? And what are other people saying about it? Why does this maybe smell like corporate capture? And why might it smell like a governor that is sane? There are a lot of different sides here, and there are a lot of different ways to think about it. Again, I think this is really worth listen, and it's worth keeping an eye on California legislation because we know two things for certain. The first is that it's going to move faster than whatever is happening at the national level. And second is that it's going to be interesting. Anyways, California Senate Bill 1047 or SB 1047. What is it? Why do we care about it? It is the first American, or, well, U.S. AI safety bill. I guess it is first American too, but U.S. AI safety bill, and one of the first 5 worldwide. Other than Biden's executive order about a year ago, a little under a year ago, this is the first concrete written thing that we've seen. NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, has mobilized in response to Biden's call, but other than that, more or less no regulations have gone out. There are some others in California that also got passed and signed recently, but this one is a little bit more contentious, and so we wanted to delve into why it is more contentious and what people are saying about it. So the bill was proposed on February 7th in 2024. It was enrolled September 9th, 2024, which is 20 days before we were recording this. And that just means that it was passed with the same wording in both the House and the Senate. It went through 10 amendments prior to being passed. Despite media coverage, which at first made it seem like that was it, that was a done deal, it is not yet signed. Governor Gavin Newsom has one more day, so on Monday, which is September 30th, he will either sign or not sign the bill, and then it will become law if he signs, and if not, then that is considered a veto, and the Senate and the House can override it with a 2/3 majority vote. So actually, it might be that if he chooses not to sign it, it might default to happening anyways, but he could veto it as well. So the specifics there, I'm not a legal expert, but that's what I've been able to glean. I think this is particularly interesting because everything that I've been able to find says that a Senate bill or a House bill should be signed by the governor within 12 days in California, and it's been 20. So I'm not sure why they gave this one extra time, but they did, and no one seems to be talking about it. It's counted as a partisan Democratic bill, which I guess is just because all the senators listed as authors are Democrats, and the official name that no one is calling it is Safe and Secure Innovation for Frontier Artificial Intelligence Models Act. That's the stuff we need to know to get like a baseline here. But what's more relevant is, what are people saying about it? How are people representing it in the media, and how they're talking about it?
Yeah, and like the main proponents of this are we would call it the AGI safety crowd. It's people from the EA and test career cluster, so like Dan Hendricks from the Center for AI Safety, Kais, who was also involved in co-sponsoring the bill. Like, did they actually co-sponsor it, as in like they have like representatives on there, or what does that mean?
Yeah, so they have an action fund, the Case Action Fund, and they helped write and support the bill. So they are actually a major player in not just the general like vibe of getting this to there, but in actually getting it through the process so far. They're saying, again, Case is saying this is a major win, citing it has 82% public support, and prominent AI nerds like Yoshua Bengio, Jeffrey Hinton, Lawrence Lessig, and Stuart Russell are all saying that they should, the governor should sign it, and that it's a good thing to pass. Their main thing, which I think is important to note, is basically critics don't get it. So people who disagree with this bill are maybe not, they're saying that they don't understand what it actually does, and
Do
that's
you,
sort of their stance.
do you have a quote for it that is like the main rebuttal? Because I've seen some of his messaging in like private conversations of like, oh, many people don't get this because law is written weirdly. Um, but I haven't seen like for example like Yoshi Benjo Finton. I mean, these are like true like foundational figures in what we call AI nowadays. And for all my disagreements, like usually like both of them are quite non-assholish in the communication. Like we're not very dismissive of the general public often. So it would be interesting to get like the exact wording there's just to not represent them.
Oh yes, absolutely. So this was not Joshua Bengio, Geoffrey Hinton, all those people. They just said we support this bill. The case messaging that I have seen, and often other messaging, including that of the author of the bill, the person who presented it, um, but the person who proposed that this is his stance as well. And so from the messaging around it, that's what I've gotten. I will link the um, newsletter sent out by Case that talks about it, so you guys can like look at that yourselves and make your own. But that's sort of the general vibe that I get as their counter argument for people who don't like the bill. And to be fair, I think that actually does somewhat hold water here, because an example of opposition that is very vocal is Andreessen Horowitz, who say it'll stifle innovation, it'll shutter small businesses, it'll let China take the lead in AI. Those are all things that they've said in things that they have published. They're saying startups feel blindsided, and the classic argument of restrict use cases, not tech itself, is being used. What is interesting about that is startups. This bill actually doesn't have an effect on anyone right now. So
So
even the
let's maybe summarize like the text of a thing a bit. Sorry for interrupting.
that's yes, that's good. Okay, so let's skip ahead to what is it saying? How is it being talked? Or yeah, what will it actually do? Um, I have covered models is an important thing to know. So covered models for this bill specifically um, is referring to very specific models. And to understand what we mean by that, we have to go through a couple different definitions. So the first is how they define artificial intelligence, which they say means an engineered or machine based system that varies in its level of autonomy and that can, for explicit or implicit objectives, infer from the input it receives how to generate outputs that can influence physical or virtual environments. Um, Before we like go further, what's your thought on this definition, Igor?
I think it's a decent one as much as anything. I think they without the additional stuff would probably be more expensive than they. I think that part is fine.
Okay, so we have a okay baseline. Now, when we get to what a covered model is an artificial intelligence model trained using a quantity of computing power greater than 10 to the 26th integer or floating point operations, or FLOP. Um, the cost of which exceeds $100 million when calculated using the average market prices of cloud compute at the start of training as reasonably assessed by the developer. So that is what a covered model is. There's one more definition, but again, before we go on,
This basically covers nobody that we know of with certainty. It might cover O1 if it was really more intensive than ChatGPT. It's important to note that like if they put a lot of compute at inference time and less at training time, that lets them to immediately gain this definition.
mm-hmm.
Um, for me, it wasn't clear if it was a 10 to the power of 26 flops and more expensive than 100 million dollars,
Yes, it
or
is.
if it is an or, it
It
is
is
an
an
and.
it is an and.
That, like this is basically putting this at a level where it will only impact the very frontier labs and maybe some future things, and maybe Llama 3 for 450B. That's the only models that this can reasonably hope to cover.
I believe, and I could be wrong here, but I believe the information we have about Llama 405B is that it is still less than the amount here. It's 10 to the 20, it's like 3 times 10 to the 25th or something
Then it
like
doesn't
that.
even cover this, and it's good. It was like the only thing that I had on my radar that isn't like the next Anthropic or OpenAI one would have been this. But then basically, assuming O1 is not considered, nothing is covered by this bill right now.
Right. Now, there is one more thing just to note because also a covered model is an artificial intelligence model created by fine tuning a covered model using a quantity of computing power equal to or greater than 3 times 10 to the fifth integer or floating point operations, the cost of which, as reasonably assessed by developers, exceeds $10 million if calculated using the average market price of cloud compute at the start of fine tuning. If less compute is used than 3 times 10 to the 25th integer floating point operations, then it is considered a covered model derivative, which is in most places that the bill says covered model, but not all places. So there are a few things that would fit as basically like if you fine tuned this and you spent tons of money, then it could be considered a new model. Or if you just fine tuned it a little bit, it would be a covered model derivative. That is the definition there. So now we've got these, I guess, really one definition that matters. And it then says what these covered models are required to do under this bill. And so from reading through the bill, this is what we've been able to gather as the things that it says you should do.
Basically, what you need to do are, I would say, 3 main blocks. Number one is you need to have the ability to do a full shutdown of all models under your control, which means that you need to cease training, cease operations, cease everything that you do with them. And notably, in the beginning, there was messaging around, oh, this then doesn't cover open models because there you don't have control over it. But there's no wording in this bill, and I talked with one of the co-writers about it. Like, there's no consideration for how you safely seize control. So this messaging was either them misunderstanding the bill, or just not caring, or just flat out lying. But there's no exceptions for open models here. Like, there's only exception for models that you don't control.
Right. Yes. Wherever it says it typically says if the developer controls the model, then it is subject to this. But it says nowhere that there is an easy or even plausible way of ceasing to control the model. It seems that after you've put it out there, at least as far as this bill is concerned right now, it is then out there, and so if it's open source, theoretically could be considered under your control.
Even worse, it could be considered you deliberately doing a weight escape and like I don't know the English legal term, but like recklessly ignoring the possibility of weight escape, which is one of the things that you need to be able to stop the model from doing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no explicit protocol here for, oh, but if you do this open source and there's these exceptions, then this doesn't cover. It's just like if you have a big enough model, this always applies, which for the perspective of people writing this is probably a good thing. Other things that you have to do is basically auditing and making a plan that you claim to do. So it's like the SOC2 or other IT certification style regulations where you need to state what you will do to avoid harm, and then the damage is only if you lied about doing the thing that you claimed to do, or if it is like documented that your thing was a reckless disregard of best practices. And part of what you need to develop is a like safety and security and responsible scaling protocol. You need to get regular audits against your protocol based on that. This is this compliance style regulation thing. And then you need to basically have a plan for the case where there's an unreasonable risk that a model could cause or enable critical harm, which is like defined as a lot of people dying or millions of dollars of property damage. Then
Yeah, so this is the part, one of the things that I found particularly interesting about how it's written as well. So they say if there is an unreasonable risk that you could cause or enable critical harm with this model, it can only be used in the three following ways. Further training and evaluation of the model, so you can keep training it, you can keep working with it internally. Compliance with state or federal law, so do whatever the government wants you to do with it. Or making the model available for commercial or public use, so selling it. And then you think about that, isn't that anything they would want to do? The only thing I can think of that doesn't fit into those three categories is selling it to a foreign government.
do you have a section of a thing where that third one is for? Because like the evaluation and government thing, sure, but it seems weird to me that like you're still allowed to put it up for commercial and public use.
Yes, it does seem weird, but that is in the that is in the thing.
Do you know which section?
I can, yeah, let me find it real quick. I think that it's in the legislative. Was it in the? I think it's mentioned in the digest. Like at least once, which I thought was particularly weird because it's like this shouldn't be the case. For a purpose not exclusively related to the training or reasonable evaluation of the covered model, or compliance with the state or federal law, or making a covered model or a covered model derivative available for commercial or public, or foreseeably public use if there is an unreasonable risk that the covered model or covered model derivative will cause or materially enable a critical harm as defined. That is, I'm reading that directly from the SB1047 like page.
Yes, I'm seeing it's like in the middle of the first like the second chunky paragraph,
Yeah.
and then okay,
And that's I'm just doing a quick Control F search. It's
yeah,
it's
seems like
mentioned
it's really
throughout the.
badly written, like I would say, because this is kind of ambiguous. This is like the bill would prohibit a developer from using a covered model or covered model derivative for a purpose not exclusively related to the training or reasonable evaluation of the covered model, or compliance with state and federal law, or making a covered model or a covered model derivative available for the use. So I can't pass this as like, is this prohibiting it except the first two things, or is this just like the equal ors and these are like the exceptions to it?
The way I read it, and I double checked this with Leah, because
Yeah.
when I first read it, I thought this doesn't make sense. So I said, Leah, please come over here and read this. And before I said anything about what I thought, I just wanted her to read it, and helped parse like the different portions because it's written in legalese the way it's written. But once that was done, she says, "This doesn't do anything," and I was like, "Yeah, right." So yeah, it seems like in actuality here, it doesn't do anything except the only thing I can think of is you can't sell it to foreign governments. Um, that's the only thing that I can think of that you would possibly want to do with a large model that is not allowed here.
I mean, this sentence doesn't even rule out like foreign government, no? It just means like if you have a model and you want to make it available for commercial or public use.
Well, but that means that it has to be equally available. So they couldn't sell it specifically to a foreign government and not allow the public or other people to also have access to buying it.
Yeah, I agree with you there. So basically, like the only thing that this does is to make sure that if there's unreasonable use, the only thing they can do is offer it to everyone. They can't even like restrict it to only people who they trust
Yes, or well,
or the government.
unless unless the U.S. government says actually you have to give it to us, and then the U.S. government can do that.
This is even less of a reasonable law now than when we start. Okay, okay,
So
that
that's yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
like that is the point. There was still a few other things like, but now that you are like under penalty of civil damages, obliged to make your covered model available only for everyone or the government or use it for your own research. At least you have to report safety incidents in case all of that goes wrong. Compute clusters need to monitor who tries to like sneak by a model, which will be totally feasible because it is extremely easy to detect what exactly a given computational load is, and something like distributed systems don't actually exist. And then there's something which is unambiguously good: whistleblower protections. Like
Yes.
we no beef with this. And then there's like create an independent board of frontier models to update the definition, blah, blah, blah. I think they can only raise the threshold, they can't lower
Correct.
it.
Uh,
At least that was in
uh
one of the digests that I read. But however, like there's a board that will update these things, and there's like the plan to make a group to create a framework for making a public a compute cluster. So that will definitely happen.
yeah. I think that's my favorite part of the bill is that there's it's written in that there is a like 3 or 4 step process that will eventually result in creating a public compute cluster. And like the first phase of it is to finish the plan to do it. And that's not for at least a year. And so it's just like comically you know, bureaucracy level bullshit. Um Whistleblower protections is not only for the big models, is my understanding. So that's also great. It's not whistleblower protections only for covered models. It's whistleblower protections for the industry. So that's very good. It's specific, so that you have to report to a specific set of people. But still, any amount of whistleblower protections I think is good to have. So that's definitely a big positive to take away from the bill.
And if something goes wrong here, the Attorney General may bring a civil action for violation of this chapter and to recover all of the following, blah blah blah, a penalty not exceeding 10% of the cost of the quantity of computing power, not exceeding 30% of that value for any subsequent violation. And I think there was like caps in like $10 million, $50 million, various things. And I think you're open for like civil liability for harms that you cause. That is like from memory now, but I think that was one of the key points. And I think it's also worth saying this is the version that the governor might or might not sign. This is
Mm-hmm.
not the version that the people that I sometimes shit on submitted.
No, yeah, and that's a good thing to bring up as well because it gets into some of the other what some of the other players are saying about it. And I think the to me the most telling is Anthropic's response and engagement with this process. So in February of 2024, this bill was presented to the Senate, and in it, it was relatively strong in a lot of the things that it said. Throughout the course of it being updated, at one point, all the different big tech companies are asked if they support the bill. And Anthropic's response was that they would support it if it was amended with the following amendments. And this is my paraphrasing to make it easier to understand. But this is exactly what was said, and I'll link a source as well. So the first request was to remove civil penalties for violations of the law unless they result in harm or an imminent risk to public safety. So civil penalties are not mentioned unless they result in harm or an imminent risk to public safety. So, financial um, harm, I don't. I think there's a pretty high threshold on that, or it isn't in there at all for civil penalties. Um, Remove frontier model division that would be funded by fees and fines on developers. And this basically would have been the oversight board, the people that were actually responsible for doing the auditing. They said, don't have someone responsible for that. Just like, trust us, I guess. At least that's my take. Remove know your customer rules for large compute. Again, I mean, this one to me doesn't make as much sense for them. I guess they don't want to limit the amount of compute they can get. I feel like it doesn't really apply to them as much, but that was one of them. I think it's especially odd because I think most people are for know your customer rules, and the idea there is it comes from finance, and basically like the people who are loaning big amounts of money should know who they're loaning it to and have like some idea of what these people are using it for and what they do. And if you loan it to someone and you have no idea what they're going to use it for, that's negligence. So that's the idea behind know your customer rules. And they said remove those. And then lastly, removing mentions of criminal penalties or legal terms like perjury. And that's actually a direct quote. Make it, which in my opinion is make it less likely that you'll actually follow through with your stated punishments. So all of those were the things that Anthropic asked. Every single one was met.
In defense of Anthropic, and like I hate doing this, but I feel the need for like not just being a hater.
No,
Out
I
of,
think that's good.
yeah, out of all the frontier labs, Anthropic is like the least worst.
That's true. And they did end up, they followed through. They said we would support it if amended. It was amended in those ways. They did not retract their support.
And I want to contrast this with OpenAI's stance, which was basically, nah, we think
Yeah.
this should be handled in a vague way on the federal level.
I don't even think they said vague way. They just said, no, we think the federal government should handle it,
No,
which is...
that was my addition, because they didn't
Oh,
say
okay.
in what way. They didn't say, yes, this exact text, but on the federal level we will support. They
Mm,
just say, we are against this legislation. We think regulation should happen on the federal level. They did not
right. They didn't
commit.
even engage with in good faith with the arguments that are being presented here. They just said you shouldn't be doing it at the state level, which
And
is another way of saying you should be letting it take as long as possible so we don't have regulation for as long as possible.
basically, yeah, but like at the state level, you can actually get stuff through because it's like less thought over, and like depending on how like polarized things are, you actually have majority. At the federal level, it's a lot bigger, so a lot more people are gonna actually join that phrase. It's gonna take longer. OpenAI has been caught lying about their desire for regulation in the EU Act, where like they lobbied to like water it down and basically like try to kill it as much as possible. So this whole making noise about, oh, we want to be regulated just in a way that's not going to affect anybody else. Well, this is it. Like this does not affect anybody else, not even you, and you're still against it. It's like, okay, cool. So as much as I agree with you that the stuff that Anthropic asked for is like very self-serving and like, in my opinion, also shows a bit like the actual belief of the people. I still think that they are more committed to like doing the right thing, and like it's like not a bad thing if you like have a different frame of mind. I would like to like zero in on the thing of like no criminal liability as well, because there's a very important thing to highlight there. Like, if you have civil liability as a billion-dollar company, and it's not a billion-dollar liability, that's cost of doing business. And
Yeah.
even if it is billions of dollars, like you can pay billions of dollars of fine and still be hugely profitable. So if you're a really hyperscaler person, civil liability is just, okay, our prices have just gone up. You can just
Right.
pass that on to the customers. criminal liability goes to the people involved at some point. Like, people go to jail, maybe like white collar jail, but still jail. So there's a lot more skin in the game for people involved. And importantly, for the game dynamics, if you and I somehow get 100 mil from some wealthy sponsor who really likes my handcrafted non-fungible tokens that are on the blockchain, they're just like cardboard, and that's why they're non-fungible. And he gives me lots of money for that. And we do a covered model from this. And there's a civil liability. When you and I, we don't have that much money. It's like an actual, like, okay, we are just completely fucked after that.
Mm-hmm.
A large corporation with limited liability, they can just go bankrupt. They're not even
Right.
gonna like, unless somebody pierces the corporate veil, which is really difficult to do. It's not gonna happen. Whereas criminal liability affects you and me, and Sam Altman the same, because we are the
Mm-hmm.
ones being like responsible, and when somebody goes to jail, it's a responsible person. So those changes are pretty huge in who does it actually affect. And like you correctly said, like, having no enforcement mechanism and a funding mechanism for enforcement is like a classic thing to kill regulation. We should really again push this paper that I keep sending you, contract design and inspections, Michael I. Jordan, where we basically prove that at a certain point you need to do random inspections
Mm-hmm.
in order for like rational agents to not just say, yeah, this thing, this bad thing that is going to create a big externality that's going to cost my principal, like the person who's hiring me, because I'm being reckless. That's bad, but it doesn't affect me. And if I keep risking it, if I keep doing a risky thing that risks this thing from happening, I can make more money. So if
Mm-hmm.
the payoff is big enough, you will keep doing that, except if there's inspections that are proportional to the risk involved that catch you and then give you a penalty, even if nothing went wrong yet, even if you get caught before, which is exactly what's being removed here. Like, the only way any of these penalties are ever going to happen is if shit goes really, really wrong.
Yeah.
And I found a definition of critical harm. Critical harm means mass casualties,
Mm-hmm.
creation of or use of chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapons in a manner that results in mass casualties, or at least $500 million of damage, so $500 million,
Mm-hmm.
resulting from cyber attacks, critical infrastructure, uh, or specific conduct, which is limited human oversight, intervention, and supervision, and then a bunch of legalese that basically say like, the model did crime. So
Mm-hmm.
if you let your ChatGPT bot steer your tanker and like it crashes into a bridge and the bridge costs $400 million to replace, not covered. Only if your bot runs unsupervised and commits like petty theft because it's a crime and you didn't have it supervised, that would then be covered.
Mm-hmm.
So the types of harms that this targets are, this is going a bit to our interpretation of things, but like are very much like the doomer harms. This is not the mundane damage of like um, LAPD uses startups facial recognition system to do precog crime, like pre-prevention, and it only flags black people for the random supervision. Like, this is not covered by that.
Right.
It also doesn't cover millions of people being denied insurance claims based on some basic logistic regression. All of that isn't covered. It's only these super big models, and only if it's kind of like sexy damage, like that is either like sci-fi scary or big enough to be like national scale thing where you could, in my opinion, bet that nobody is gonna buy the, oh, but it's the model and it's research excuse if this amount of damage happens. So like this part of the law, I think, is completely redundant it's always a good thing to have more clarity, but yeah, I think this is overall like a vacuous law, even more after we talked about that. If they do everything they need to do, even with a critical harm, that will still like be fine if
Yeah.
sort of the consensus of the community is, oh yeah, you couldn't foresee that.
Yep.
And
So I guess like I think that I agree with you there, and I think that's like a really important thing to note. There, part of noting that is just there are other AI bills that California has recently passed, and some of them do address some of these smaller things. I would say that they are not really like the scale of responsibility that or liability that needs to be placed. I am saying that lightly because I believe there are like 38, so I haven't had the time to go through all of them super carefully. But that is also what a lot of the critics are saying. Or at least one of the things that people critique about it is like, wait, you're regulating these like sci-fi harms. That's like crazy. Um, and I mean, it's a great move on the tech side, on the big tech side, because they've basically put themselves into a situation where they say, okay, well, these existential safety people exist, so unless you're going to be regulating the thing that like people are saying is really scary, then like it doesn't really seem fair because like you're not even regulating the thing that people think is really scary. Um, and then after the like existential risk stuff starts being regulated, they point at the existential risk people and they say, "Look at those guys. They think some sci-fi shit's gonna happen. Those people are crazy, right?" And it's like, what do you want them to do then? Like you're saying that it's not okay to regulate in one way, but it is okay to regulate in that way, and then using it against the people just doesn't make any sense to me.
I didn't get that. It's the point that like they argue against the basic laws, and then they also argue against the sci-fi laws, or more in the sense of like they pass a sci-fi law, and then they point at the sci-fi scared people, kind of bad mouthing them, or
So the what I'm saying is basically like a reasonable law that provides liability across the board. The sort of arguments against that would be, well, you don't actually care about these like across the board rules. What you actually care about are these existential risk preventions, because that's something that people are thinking about, and so that's really what we should be regulating. And that's what would happen if you present these like more sane regulations. But then when you present the sci-fi regulation that is saying, okay, fine, we'll just target the existential risks. We'll just target these really high threshold things. They then point at the people that are proposing that bill and say, those people are crazy. They're
who's they in this?
big tech.
So Andreessen Horowitz.
Andreessen Horowitz, yeah, that's a good. I mean, not everyone like within that sphere, and there are other groups as well. But I think using Andreessen Horowitz as the sort of personification, I guess, of these.
I'm happy to generalize the faceless husks of men who are only carried by the billions, and like put Andreessen Horowitz and Mark Andreessen and all of them into the same bucket, because they're all
Yes.
performing the same function.
So yes, that is the Andreessen Horowitz argument there.
But like I think it's important, like also like to make like a critical critique of this thing, that like the Andreessen Horowitz kind of like I don't want to use the name they use themselves, but like the edgelords who fancy themselves accelerationist of technology, like that crowd is not having any of these conversations. They are thinking about, okay, cool, how can I steal as much data as possible to fine tune my thing, and then like make AI slop to make it big, and maybe I can bring back crypto like this. Like that's like the thing, and like in the latest iteration, they're going after anime apparently, because that like was like the latest Fortfluencer piece that one of them dropped.
Mm.
But like that's not the TestGrail crowd, like the EA crowd. That's also not, I think, the people who are calling for generic like regulations. So kind of like the playbook that you just described. I think the it goes more in the sense of like there's great risks, but also existential things. So like we need to push forward and figure these grand issues out. And they don't even talk about the mundane harms because those are actually something you would need to address. So they just try to like gaslight you about them not even being a thing and about the AI working. And because it's working so well, we need to think about it. I've never actually seen anyone engage with like the critique of, hey, your ML system doesn't work on the level of, oh, but you should think about it. Actually, what I've seen is people saying like, oh yeah, we're working on it. It's only gonna get better. And like I think it's important to not entangle those things. Like the dishonest techniques of tech bros who are trying to just like rush to market without any form of risk considerations is orthogonal to people who actually care but have drunken the Kool-Aid of the big payoff of the AGI and are therefore willing to allow shit like OpenAI, basically.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I appreciate the clarification, basically, of what I'm saying. I think I got a little bit worked up about it because it really, really gets me. Um, so, just,
yeah.
yeah.
So, like, who is happy about this bill? Though? Like, we have one note here that there was also critique of Dan Hendryck's spin-off startup thing. This is basically like a form of regulatory capture, and it's just gonna like create a market for AI auditing firms. And it's like the we can also interrogate kind of like the like our critique is this doesn't do anything. Why are we even talking about it?
Right.
What heads of I have other critique we're going to get to, but that's it. There's also like the generic rebuttal against regulation of, oh, but this will stifle innovation. So if you take that serious, there is this thing of like, you now need to do auditing if you reach this level. And so like, let's say you are like a startup that can scrounge together 100 million of investment or get sponsored in some way or through some way achieves the ability to do compute, which would cost 100 mil. Let's say you have like some genius chip designer who gets you that chip and the price would drop if you release it, but you don't, so it's still that worth that much. Then you have to do all of this additional auditing and safety planning. What do you think about that? Is that reasonable of a critique?
Sorry. Sorry. Can you repeat that? The is what reasonable?
Like, is that critique of A, Dan Hendricks, and B, of the bill? But like, Dan and his startup are just trying to do a regulatory capture and making like a market for himself. That's like one critique. And the other one is this generic, like, this will stifle innovation critique. What do you think about
Yes.
that?
Okay. So the first is about Dan Hendricks' startup. It's called Gray Swan, and their like thing, I guess, is quote tools to help companies assess the risks of their AI systems. End quote. Um, and companies like this have a lot to gain from this bill because it's basically mandating that these big corporations actually do auditing. So this is the customer base for something like this auditing group. And Dan saw this and in response divested from the startup. Although he will continue to work as an advisor, he won't receive any payment. To me, this seems like sort of he thinks these like it's good to be doing what he wants to do with Gray Swan, and it's good to be pushing this bill. And he saw the conflict of interest and sort of removed himself from it in the way that he best can, while still pushing both things forward. Which if you compare that to a lot of how most of the like big tech CEOs conduct themselves, that's like very very good to see. Definitely has class and makes it a lot harder to critique in that regard.
Yeah, so like I would say it's basically like I have lots of disagreements with Dan, but I like respect him. And
Hmm.
like I would say, like we like speaking over, like we still like Dan, and I think this critique kind of like falls a bit flat because, like, of course, like if you think there should be auditing and there should be safety mechanisms, then you're gonna push for these things, and managing those conflicts of interest is a challenge. But I think this was like the correct way of doing it. So like
Yeah.
this first critique point, we say, okay, that kind of has been resolved. What about the second part, the stifling of innovation?
Yeah, the second part to me, I mean, that's the classic it'll stifle innovation argument. And the thing is that, I mean, that's just always what the big tech people say. And they say that until a massive catastrophe has happened in which, like, it's impossible to uh, ignore the consequences, basically. And so if we allow that to happen, as we did with social media, for example, that's just the one that's been most recent before this, so it's the thing that's on my mind. But there are tons of other examples. Um, then we get to a situation where the bad thing does happen and we have to scramble to try to regulate it, and it's harder to do because we've already let it go on for so long and people have found the use, have integrated this new technology into their lives. Fundamentally, that argument is very difficult for me to sort of make full sense of without very concrete, specific targets or things that people are aiming for. The just it'll hurt innovation to me says they're courting money, the people who are trying to make money here. And so, for example, other people in government like Nancy Pelosi, who I guess is still relevant, um, is saying that she doesn't support this bill because she thinks it'll hurt innovation. But like any actual tangible or like substantive thing there, there isn't. And that's often the case. When you look at what this bill is actually doing, and like we said, the limitations are very modest. Actually, they are basically non-existent. In fact, um, it's pretty straightforward, high level. Like you should have some plans for safety. You should be anywhere near being like subject to audits, even though functionally it probably won't happen. Um, you should have whistleblower protections. Like all these things that it's presenting, I just don't think are actually that um, out there. I don't think they're really doing too much. And so for that reason, I I really question the like it'll stifle innovation. Two quick things on that because I do want to get on to like some of the rest of the stuff that we have. But Governor Gavin Newsom, who is now the only person that matters here, because it is just his signature that is on the table, has said that he believes it doesn't solve today's problems, which I think Igor and I would agree is very true. And he doesn't want to stifle California's booming AI industry, which is basically just saying he wants to stay on the good side of big tech. He thinks the bill will be bad for open source, which is something that we're going to bring up in just a little bit. But I hesitate. He fully understands what he's saying there. And he alluded that he believes that signing SB1047 won't actually disrupt the AI industry, but that signing many wrong bills over the course of the next few years would be enough to have meaningful waves. So whether he signs it, who knows? At this point, it will be out by the time I release this episode, whether he signed it or not. Let's see. We've got some actors in Hollywood who are calling for him to sign it, which is always fun when they weigh in. And yeah, it really seems to me that uh, he's just trying to court big tech basically because the Chamber of Progress, who's a trade group representing Google, Apple, Amazon, and a bunch of other big tech companies, they are scared. They're saying it will restrain free speech, which is something that no one else is saying. It's because it's absurd. But they are making that claim. And so I think it's important to note that despite all of these um, real problems with the bill, big tech is actually scared of it. And I think that alludes to the fact that it actually goes in the direction that would start regulation for them.
The There's a couple of pithy like alliterations around these strategies of like uh, distract, delay, derail, distract, delay, deny, all these things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also a thing in environmental and like medical things where um, in the beginning you try to just like not talk about it, then you try to delay any reasonable inquiries as much as possible, and then once there's like undeniable proof of harm, you just try to like derail any attempt to resolve it. And we're seeing this still with like the climate crisis as well. So I think it's like very correctly pointed out as like an empty thing. Do you want to go into the open source?
Yeah, let's talk about that bit. And like, so basically, what does this bill mean? Is sort of like the final uh, portion here, as well as like what the meaningful bits are within all of this muck that we've gone through today. So, what is your take on how it is meaningful?
Well, like I took this bridge to the open source because the only thing this will actually stifle are open sourcing covered models.
Mm-hmm.
Because as we said, there's no way to seize control without basically breaching best practice. Because, and this needs to be emphasized as well, the best practices of this AGI catastrophe level safety is done in OpenAI's, DeepMind's, and Anthropic's AI safety, blah blah blah. Because they're the only ones who still have them because, like, Tim Gabriel and so got fired, so they work on stuff that actually affects real people. So the best practices in this like things is Dan Hendricks and his affiliated people and the Frontier Labs, because they're the only ones who think about these side things. It's like there's a handful of others, but they're all in the same community.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever they do basically is the best practices, including Meta as well. But Meta does one thing that they don't do, which is share the models. So actually,
Right.
other people can also check the work, and it's not just trust us, bros. We are really good at this. You can actually check it,
Mm-hmm.
and that is gonna be prohibited, even if like the current Llama 405B is not gonna be covered. The next one will be, and then there's no way under this current environment of responsible open sourcing of frontier models. So
So so there let's talk about what the counter to that would be, I think, first. And also um yeah, well, let's just start with the counter. To me, the counter would be sure, but we're going to raise the compute amount then. So it slows it down a little bit, but it doesn't actually stop it because we've put into the bill a way to keep this updated, a way to prevent that from happening. I don't know if I fully agree with that, like because I do think I mean that it will still meaningfully slow things down. But I think that would be the main counter argument as to what you're saying.
I mean, there's even more context. Like there's no evidence that Meta is actually gonna like open weight 405B if it's actually good. There's also like the Llama series is not open source ML. Like
No, it is not.
Meta keeps control over it, and you need to get like licenses, and they give it to you under certain conditions. So like, um, but it will stop Mistral style just model drops, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I will believe that the compute amount is being raised when I see it, because this is going to be a committee, and like hedging the ability to do it on that is unlikely. Um, that being said, like bringing this back to does this matter? Um, it only matters in the like direction and the signaling. That like this is the first high profile AI bill. Even if there's 38 hours in California, like no disrespect to the sponsors of those bills, but like apparently nobody cared enough to discuss these.
Right.
And like compare this with like the EU AI Act, which was like a big thing because it actually stops things. Like
Yeah.
Meta is not releasing some of their models because they still need to go through like the certification of things, and like certain things are just banned in all of the EU for also the state to do with AI. Like
Right.
compare that with those small state bills and also this bill, but like the one actually stops real harms today and slows things down right now. This one will, at some point, maybe slow things down, except if the frontier labs, who this might at some point apply to, decide that it's cost of doing business. So, like, the only theoretical slowdown that I see would be on these open source plays to come at the incumbents, um, which is not like out of kindness, but as a like like chess play thing. You try to build a brand or to commoditize, you complement all of that stuff. That's the only thing that this bill is actually going to stop, because those plays they depend on very like fine grained like cost and friction. Like if your business is doing one thing, and then you can also like release a model that you basically just made as a side fact because you needed one to the public, and that happens to commodify your competitions and like drive the margins down so now they can't like cross subsidize their product, you might do that. If the open sourcing is going to commit you to continuous monitoring and auditing and a bunch of other stuff, you're probably not going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And like you might have to do the monitoring anyway, but you're going to get like headaches if you open source, because that's not something anybody else will do. So this
Right.
commits you to, unless you're really believing in fighting the system on this, to just following the subtle nudge towards not sharing even at the level of Meta and Mistral. So
Yeah.
that's the only very soft, very nobody else will care about this bill. I think like the Frontier Labs are already doing most of these things. They can successfully talk down the penalties. They remove the ability for proactive enforcement, so there's nobody gonna be checking in on this stuff. So otherwise, it's completely nothing. And as I learned from you on a close reading, you can still just keep doing business even
Yeah.
if like it flags something, which like holy shit.
Yeah, I guess that's like to for me what I like about it, because I think we're slightly different on stance on this bill, and I don't know how the realization that like it doesn't actually do anything, it doesn't actually prevent you from doing anything, changes your stance either. But I think that it's net good because it is something that is on the books that actually begins to work towards liability. And I think that is seen within the fact that it was mentioned in earlier versions of the bill, and it was explicitly removed. Um, so I think it's positive that it's going in that direction. It's the only one that I've heard of, at least, that does this to any extent, and so that's why I think like even though it's not what I want, it does affect open source more than I want it to. Um, Big tech is scared about it. It potentially has meaningful restrictions on them that will cause them to um, do more than they would have otherwise, and it doesn't actually affect anyone. That's the other thing. It no one is seeing anything bad from this bill right now. If it were passed, there is no effect whatsoever, and that to me that says like, okay, well, if we're just putting something out there that says, you know, if this gets big enough, we would like to have something on the books that prevents it from, going completely haywire. That seems pretty reasonable to me. And also the whistleblower protections are fantastic. I'm really happy that we have that. So that's my take. What about you?
Like, it's difficult to say like the net good, net bad. The Overton window effect is one that I hadn't considered yet, so I think that is good. Whoever wrote in the proactive enforcement and criminal liability stuff in the beginning, assuming it was an actual goal and not like a sacrificial, oh, we're going to push this into a ridiculous thing to get what we really want.
Mm-hmm.
That is like a signal that like that seems to be somebody who's actually trying to do like, sure, like sci-fi risk, but actually regulating the sci-fi risk. So like
Right.
that is also good. I still think, to be honest, that like the outcome of this is like, if this isn't followed with like additional lobbying for mundane AI risks as well, and if this is gonna not be like the first of many bills, I think this will be a net negative. But it has
Mm-hmm.
now anchored a bunch of things that I consider like bad, the open source thing, but also just this focus on the sci-fi risk at the complete like disregard of like smaller scale things, and even like considerations like there's not really a concept in here for like very dispersed harm that is not uniquely traceable to the model, but just like the model being an enabler in something. Like if you
Mm-hmm.
supervise the model doing massive harm or crime, then it doesn't apply. Stuff like this. So that's why I still expect it to be a net bad. However, this is like a speculation based in my pessimism around the industry, and I might be wrong. And on its own merits, and assuming it's gonna be followed up with more stuff, because like that's like your model of like it's a first step,
Mm-hmm.
then I would agree with like it's a good thing. Um,
Yeah, I think that's also very important to note is that I'm seeing this as a step. I don't think this is the end all be all. I don't think that this is the best way to do this by any means. But what I appreciate about it is that it starts working in a direction that I think has potential to be meaningful. And so, yeah, I do see the pessimism because I'm not, the most optimistic person when it comes to that. Um, but yeah, that's my current stance, and
like I
it
would
could
not.
it could be bad. It could be bad if we just stop here, and we're done with regulating AI and everyone anchors to this. That would not be good.
I would not shit on anybody having pushed this bill through because like it's not a bad thing.
Hmm.
I will shit on everybody who points at this and says, "See, we're doing stuff. Therefore, like this stuff is credible, and we have now proven that we care about the common man." Because like none of that is in there. What should also be flagged is like this bill has no. I mean, like again, it is completely reasonable for this bill to have that, but this bill like has the compute sharing thing. It doesn't have anything of like economic devastation and obligation to provide a pension for like an industry that you obsolete, like all these things, which is like a
Right.
reasonable thing that is only so much you can put in there. But with us contextualizing things, I want to add that in there. That like people keep talking about the UBI part, or like they used to, and now like Sam has abandoned talking about the AI dividend that he used to sometimes trot out, and it's gonna go for profit now. And I see it in this context that like we get this continued anchoring on the sci-fi risks that sucks up the oxygen in the air, that keeps propping up this myth of the AI being capable,
Hmm.
and we anchor it on auditing and reporting and civil liabilities status now, and which is a good thing, whistleblower protections, which I could see Newsom vetoing this just because of the whistleblower protections, because that's actually something like it's the only actual thing that this bill does, but it could be bad, right? Like based on how much bullshit happens in software industry, how much like complete garbage security practices are just common practice.
So you're saying I think that things are so bad in terms of cybersecurity and like management practices at these big tech companies that instantly or quite close to instantly, um, there will be enough like whistleblowers coming out saying, "Look at all these bad things that are happening in big tech,"
So,
just because there are whistleblower protections, and like that would stifle innovation, I suppose. I mean, it would probably be good to do, but
so since our last episode, 7 days, OpenAI's X account was hacked to promote a crypto scam. On
yeah.
so like, sure, that's not the thing that they secure the most.
Wait, are you sure it was hacked? It sounds like the kind of thing that they would promote.
Uh, what?
I'm being facetious. I was a joke. Uh, yeah.
Like
No.
it wasn't Sam's creepy eyeball crypto thing, by the way. It was like some shitcoin. But I'm gonna.
Oh, so it was. So the real problem is that it was a competitor. It was someone else's crypto scam, not theirs.
I presume that was the main concern. Yes, but no, like
Classic.
I genuinely think that like this, like if we look at what this bill actually does, and then what is like the actual effect, the only good thing about it is whistleblower protections, and then like not the only thing, but like the main good thing,
Hmm.
and then that might be enough to strike down because like in general, the powers that be fucking hate being held accountable even a little bit.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's maybe like my summary take. Like whoever put in the actual accountability things in the original bill, good signal that you're probably fighting for the right thing. Like for like the EA people who want to like select their policy drafting people, give that person more of your like EA 10% money. Then like uh, Entropic was revealed as actually within their framework sticking to their value system, but like they actually want to be regulated in a certain way, and they're not just like mouthing it. OpenAI was continuously masked off as has been a theme also this week. Um, Dan continues to be validated as like actually like an honorable person in this,
Hmm.
and I'm gonna take the auditing even if I think it's gonna create like moral hazard in some way without the inspection power. But maybe we can get that in the next bill, and then under that condition would be a net positive, and otherwise for me probably like a net negative because of this anchoring effect. So
Yeah.
that would be like my summary of all of the meaningful bits of like insight and data that you can get from thinking about this bill that I was. Oh, and but the people who are in these think tanks in the yay bubble really don't care about open source and don't see like centralization and um, monopolization as a bad thing, which I think will come back to bite them because this is kind of like the social naivete that brought the original board down. That they like you know like the OpenAI board that they thought they could get all of these Silicon Valley money people on there to do the right thing and like a board structure is gonna like keep them alive, and they didn't actually like play the power politics of a corporate structure. And I think yeah, that's like something to flag for anyone feeling targeted by the statement.
Uh, yeah. I guess the last thing from me, because you covered basically everything, and I am in large agreement. So first, actual U.S. legislation that's like being talked about and may have an impact seems meaningful. Whether that's good or bad, we'll see. The fact that it does seem there are hints of corporate capture, or even full, sweeps of corporate capture in some senses, is also meaningful. Pointing out we're sort of already there in terms of corporate capture. I think, especially if Governor Newsom decides to veto the bill, I, it's sort of cut and dry to me. Like, there's only one reason that he would be vetoing it when 82% of the public supports this bill. And that is that he doesn't want to lose the money from big tech. So
there's a question here. Can OpenAI just fuck off to Texas?
This is a good clarification that you've brought up. Any company doing business in California is subject to this legislation, meaning they will have to completely remove any semblance of their product from California, which is a nightmare in terms of how you would have to go through that process. So fundamentally, it does not change. Like, it affects everyone the same. It even affects Mistral, at least in theory. In practice, are they doing business if they just put it online and then it's accessible in California? I don't know. But, like, in theory, they can't sell to people in California. People in California wouldn't be allowed to use their platform, for example, which I think they've recently come out with or something like that. So that's an important thing to note, is that a lot of the critics are saying, this is going to chase people away from California. This is going to move big tech to other places like Texas or something like that. When in reality, that's just not going to happen. That's not how the bill's written.
So the only way, if you want to ignore this bill, would be like you geo-block California, and like you would need to make sure that like also like any credit card thing that is associated with a California company, all of that stuff is not a thing. And if you do that, even then, like it might be nice to be out of the US jurisdictions, so that like there's like a strong defense to be made of, okay, like we have geo-blocked everyone. One of your employees used the VPN and branch credit card to make us do business in California. That's not enough to do like some international like dispute thing. So kind of no. That's like the Mistral play if they wanted to ignore this act.
Right. Which, I mean, they could do. I think the only company that could do that viably right now is Mistral. Well, and that's also if and only if they ever decide to make a model that's that big, which they may not. Like, going back to what we were talking about last week, like, is it really worth going the next order of magnitude up at this point? Is there what can be gained? Because
points on the benchmarks.
Right, but like that's not worth it if you have to then comply with all this stuff, right?
Maybe. I think this is something that is worth, once we have like another quiet week, to actually dig into like what is a percentage point on a benchmark actually worth? Like, what does that translate into?
Yeah. Whew. Okay, well, that's all the muck we can stand for this week. If anything, this proves that getting involved in debates around policy is super useful. So go out there, talk about these bills. I know that I learned something during this conversation with Igor, and I know he did too. So perhaps most importantly, hit subscribe and share this podcast around if you thought it was helpful. And until next time.